Coming up in today's newscast, state officials in Israel enter full campaign mode following yesterday's decision to dissolve the current government. Suspects involved in a major international drug smuggling ring are given extended remands without any charges filed, and Christians from the world over arrive in Bethlehem for a special midnight mass on Christmas Eve. In a landmark speech Monday evening, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition partners agreed to dissolve their government and the parliament with it, launching early elections this April. The final bill to disband the Knesset is set to pass on Wednesday. But in fact, Netanyahu said that he wanted to spark elections weeks ago after former Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman resigned, and he only postponed the decision in order to first attend to the Hezbollah terror tunnels along the Lebanese border. That being said, he continued that, with God's help, the Likud will win again, and the same core parties will form the next coalition to, quote, complete our work.
באים לבקש מנדט ברור מהבוחר להמשיך להוביל את מדינת ישראל בדרך שלנו. הדרך הזאת עשתה רבות לאזרחי ישראל, והדרך הזאת תעשה רבות לטובת מדינת ישראל.
The opposition, which also allows the coming elections, though, isn't planning to go down without a fight. Zionist Union Chairman Avi Gabay said the battle with the Prime Minister lies essentially with him and him alone, while his party partners like Tzipi Livni echoed his sentiments, that the ruling government has destroyed Israeli democracy and that a change is needed. Other opposition leaders like Ahmad Tibi, Tamar Zandberg, and Avigdor Lieberman also joined in the campaign trail, charging that the ineffective government must be brought down. Even Gideon Sa'ar, former education and interior minister with the Likud, officially signaled his return to politics in the running against Netanyahu, forcing his television anchor wife, Geula Evan-Sa'ar, to resign from the Kan Public Broadcasting Network on Monday. Still, all the polls so far put the Likud with Netanyahu at the helm in the lead with 30 Knesset seats, regardless of who runs against him, which is virtually ensuring that Netanyahu's predictions for April will come true. With the newly called elections, analysts and critics have gone into overdrive to determine the reason Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu decided to dissolve the coalition after having fought so ardently to keep the government going just a few weeks earlier. While at face value the coalition seems to have collapsed due to infighting over the contested ultra-Orthodox enlistment bill, critics believe that there is a more sinister reasoning at play, namely the threat of looming indictments over Netanyahu in the Walla Bezic corruption case, or Case 4000. Leaked reports from Attorney General Avichai Mandelblatt's office revealed that he may issue his decision on indictments in Case 4000 before the elections in April, and therefore analysts point out that it is no coincidence that Netanyahu called for elections at this time. Mandelblatt only this week announced that he would begin reviewing the case files, but of all three cases facing Netanyahu, Case 4000 is considered the most serious. The Prime Minister is suspected of having advanced regulatory decisions in exchange for positive coverage from the Walla News website. But in a press conference announcing the elections, Netanyahu, of course, would not comment on whether Case 4000 played any factor. So whether this is the real reason behind the dissolving of the coalition or not, one thing is certain. The possible indictment announcement of Netanyahu and its timing will be a major issue on the campaign trail. In related news, prosecutors have until today to reach a deal for Sarah Netanyahu to confess to a misuse of state funds or face going to a criminal trial during the national election campaign. Sarah Netanyahu faces charges of fraud and breach of trust for allegedly spending around 350,000 shekels, or roughly $100,000, on private meals in the Prime Minister's residence, while there was a full-time chef on staff. Also impacted by the announced elections, the selection of a permanent commissioner for the Israeli police could be put on hold until after a new government is sworn in. Currently, Moti Cohen is serving as the interim police chief after Roni Alshech ended his term and the candidate selected by the Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan was forced to resign amid scandal over his conduct in the vetting process. Cohen has a mandate to serve for only a limited time, though, but the elections and dissolution of the Knesset could delay finding him a permanent replacement. Returning now to the studio to further discuss the prospects of indicting the Prime Minister ahead of April 9th elections is attorney and political analyst Gal Babayov. Gal, thank you so much for coming back with us today.
Thank you for inviting.
All right, so, first of all, let's just start off with, do you think that there's any credence to the accusations that, the dissolving of the government now, the timing of that, had anything to do with delaying, voting on anything or delaying the indictments against Netanyahu?
First things first, the coalition has reached its end due to the fact that they've lost all their political capital running a 61-seat government. It's very, very difficult at times. Prime Minister Netanyahu would not have been able to pass any legislation whatsoever that he wanted to. On the accusations that the timing was political, of course it's political. It was done to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu's personal agenda, that being trying to create the largest political party, the Likud, on April 9th. I do not want to believe that it had any conjunction with the fact that the Attorney General Mandelblatt has to submit his recommendations within in the foreseeable future.
Okay, so we'll come back to the indictments for a moment, but again, with the voting and all that other stuff, you mentioned that of course it's political and he wants to return with a stronger Likud, and Netanyahu said much the same thing, but he also said that he's likely going to end up with pretty much the exact same coalition as the core. So what's the point? What's the difference?
One major factor that people have to remember here in Israel right now is the legislation regarding Haredi drafting into the military. That is a very, we'll call it, important point for the Haredi community.
But that bill isn't going anywhere.
It's not going to go anywhere at all. And the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave assurances to the Supreme Court that he would legislate by January 15th and could not deliver was one of the better reasons to dissolve the government.
So then what happens in April? So assuming that Netanyahu is right, that the polls are right, he returns with practically the same coalition, what then?
At a starting point of a new government, you start everything all over again. You negotiate the terms of entering the coalition. You negotiate the terms of who receives what seats in government. That is a strong point where Prime Minister Netanyahu can take that to his advantage to try to leverage the Haredi Knesset members to try to be more agreeable with this legislation regarding their drafting.
I see. Okay, now going to the indictments. With Attorney General Mandelblatt, he's now been given an 800-page report on the allegations against the Prime Minister. And as you said, up until the election was called, we had assumed that he would come out with a recommendation one way or the other within the next few months. He still can ahead of the elections, but will he? Is it likely?
From a legal point of view, he has his own right. He can submit his recommendations at any given time.
Sure.
Does he want to do that now? That's the major question, because basically the decision of Attorney General Mandelblatt will affect the election here in Israel in any way you do it. If he submits his recommendation to indict Prime Minister Netanyahu, it'll thwart the political scales either left or right,
sure,
according to what everybody wants to see.
Of course. But again, as an Attorney General, doesn't he have maybe an obligation to the state to be forthright and to be efficient and come out with a recommendation sooner than later? Because what happens if he recommends to indict the Prime Minister after he's been reelected?
That is a political debate that we do not even know how to address, because up until now, any official or elected officials in Israel have been indicted after they've sat in office for a certain time. Former Prime Minister Olmert, former President Katsav, and such and so forth. When we look at the timeline, we've seen that these inquiries, and they've only been inquiries, Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been indicted as of yet. He's not even started any process of indictment, have been going on for years. Mm-hmm. Government has been trying, we'll call it the legislative branch, has been trying to concoct a theory that says that Prime Minister Netanyahu is corrupt and he should leave his office. And certain people in certain political parties are aiming to that fact and hoping that Attorney General Mandelblatt will submit his recommendations sooner rather than later. The flip side of that is it'll be an election that will not be... We're talking about an election that might be twisted into a fact that it'll turn into Mandelblatt's election or a non-confidence in Prime Minister Netanyahu and not what the people want from a point of ideology.
From a political standpoint. All right, well, that's a fair point. Thank you so much for coming in, Gad.
Thank you.
All right, it seems that the government functions, negotiations, and investigations in Israel aren't the only things being brought to a halt following the announcement of snap early elections this April. Just hours after Prime Minister Netanyahu dissolved the coalition and in response to it, the White House announced that once again its much-anticipated Israel-Palestinian peace plan will be delayed. Trump administration officials explained that they don't want to influence the Israeli vote. Mark Zell, the head of the Republican Party in Israel, said he couldn't imagine that anyone in the White House would think about releasing the plan in this volatile time, and indeed Washington has also insinuated that releasing the plan at this time would only serve to be used as a campaign platform one way or the other. First delayed from publication in September, the Trump Middle East peace plan will now only likely be released after the dust has settled in April and after a new coalition is sworn in during the weeks that follow. In somewhat related news, it seems that according to Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, relations between Moscow and Washington are, quote, practically non-existent, end quote, and there is very little prospect for improvement in the near future. This according to the Associated Press, which reported on Nebenzia's statements on a wide range of topics while speaking to a small group of journalists. Among his stated reasons, Nebenzia went on to blame the ongoing investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller into Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections as hindering U.S.-Russian relations for the near future. But that's not all. Regarding the United States' withdrawal of troops from Syria, Nebenzia echoed Russian President Vladimir Putin's views that it was a positive move that would help conclude the 7-year conflict raging in the country. But when asked about the Russian presence in Syria, however, he said the only reason it was there was to prevent another Libya and to curb another terrorist caliphate. In fact, the Russian envoy continued that he believes the greatest threat facing the world today is not any one country, including Iran, but rather terrorism in general. He told the Associated Press that what's needed is, quote, a true coalition to fight international terrorism, end quote, and that he did not believe the U.S. was retreating from the world stage despite Trump's America First rhetoric. That being said, the Russian envoy said he believes the two countries must talk about global issues, including strategic stability and global terrorism, and said that he thinks U.S. President Donald Trump, quote, understands pretty well that it's better to cooperate, end quote. Finally, with regards to Iran, Nebenzia said that he worries about the United States' strategy if its sanctions don't bring about changes of the country's behavior. He told the AP that it's, quote, a danger if they go to the limits, end quote, adding that the enigma and question remains, what would be the strategy about Iran if any state wanted to go to war with the Islamic Republic? In other news, Argentine federal judge Sandra Arroyo Salgado has just removed herself from a lawsuit that initiated an investigation into the death of her ex-husband, the prosecutor Alberto Nisman. For the last decade leading up to his murder, Nisman was dedicated to investigating the 1994 bombing of the AMIA Jewish Center in Buenos Aires. And AlTV's Joy Gavijon is here with more on the story. Joy?
Thanks, Aaron. So in order to understand this, we need to go back to the beginning.
Okay.
So as you said, Nisman spent many years investigating the bombing terror attack against the AMIA Jewish Center that took place in 1994 and left 85 dead and around 300 wounded.
This is an attack for which the Iranian-backed Hezbollah terror group is blamed for.
Exactly, yes. But in 2015, Nisman formally accused the then Argentinian president, Cristina Kirchner, and some of her political allies of covering up for former Iranian officials that were charged with being involved in the attack. So because of this, Nisman was set to present the evidence he collected against the former president to the Argentinian lawmakers. But the thing is that only hours before that, Nisman was found dead in his apartment.
Yeah, I remember we covered this a bit, and and it sounds like a movie script actually. Because at first the police said that he committed suicide, and then years later, a federal judge ruled that he was actually murdered.
Right. In 2017, after new investigation reports, it was confirmed that Nisman was a victim of homicide. More precisely, that he was killed by two men. And here's where all the ideas and theories of the former government's involvement in Nisman's death came up.
All right. So now where are we? Is this now where we get to like the lawsuit and his ex-wife then?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Until now, the federal judge, Rojo Salgado, that it's the ex-wife of Nisman, acted as the plaintiff for this lawsuit, something that allowed her to read the reports of the investigation and submit requests. But this week, she decided to take a step aside and remove herself from the case. Salgado explained that this process has been very exhausting for her family, and she even mentioned that since 2015, her family has been the subject of constant threats until now. So because of this, she sent a letter to a colleague with her decision, and she said that her only goal right now is to keep her family safe.
All right, well, this has been quite a journey, as we know, for Salgado, and hopefully, the investigation will continue despite her dropping out and will lead to the truth of what actually happened to Nisman. In the meantime, thanks for your report, Joy.
Thank you, Aaron.
5 alleged drug smugglers who supposedly brought into Israel large quantities of cocaine on int'l flights have just been given extended remands despite no charges having yet been filed. The suspects can now remain in detention beyond the usual 30 days without any indictments filed against them. The 5 suspects are supposedly members of a larger drug smuggling network and include both Beno Shalom, a former Shin Bet official who worked in the past as head of security to the Prime Minister, and Rami Yogev, a high-ranking int'l security liaison. A total of 11 suspects in the case have been arrested so far, though, with one already having reportedly turned state's witness. That's why, despite no indictments having yet been announced, Judge Guy Avnon agreed that there was plenty of evidence to justify extending remand for the 5 aforementioned individuals. Police attorney Nadav Rapoport also called the issue a, quote, large and wide-ranging affair when speaking to the latest remand hearings. And in a statement from int'l released to Ynet, the airline said that it was taking the investigation very seriously and will be working with law enforcement officials as necessary. All right, as the saying goes, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. While opening a window into the mind of Zev Jabotinsky, one of the Jewish nation's foremost thinkers whose legacy helped pave the way for modern Israel, is a pretty great place to start. And so in commemoration of the 90th anniversary of the 1929 Hebron massacre, the Menachem Begin Heritage Center and the Jabotinsky Institute are proud to introduce the 7th volume of Jabotinsky's writings, entitled The Land of Israel II, and here to tell us all about it is the deputy editor for the English anthology volumes of Jabotinsky's writings, Israel Medad. Israel, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure. All right, so tell us a little bit about The Land of Israel II. What's in it?
Well, as you said, it's the 7th volume. It's a projected maybe 25 or maybe even 30 volumes. We've divided Jabotinsky's writings and thinking into about half a dozen sections, and each one is running separately with a group of editors. It's a critical edition, which means that there are a lot of footnotes because things happened over 100 years ago or more. And this volume is dedicated to the period of about the late 1920s into the very early 1930s. Jabotinsky lived here between 26 and 1929. We have the riots, Hebron and other places, the building up of Tel Aviv, and the beginning of the conflict with Great Britain, politically speaking, as it begins to recede from the mandate. So there's a great historical insight, but of course there are a lot of lessons that we learn from the political, diplomatic, and otherwise realities on the ground here.
Okay, so you started to mention that a little bit, about the differences between this edition and the other volumes. What is maybe, can you give us a little bit of, a little bit more specifics about what's new in this edition, that we haven't seen before?
Well, first of all, what's new is we found some articles that have been almost lost, shall we say. They come from some newspapers, either from the Russian, the Yiddish, or the English that he dealt with at the time. Little items that give a little bit of interesting, he writes here in April 1929, Tel Aviv is the most spoken about city in the world. Now, there you have number one, Tel Aviv, number two, not only Jerusalem, number two, his optimism, number three, his enthusiasm about trying to project Zionism, which I think today we're stuck in battles about Zionism, when then it was a...
Well, and his kind of views on Zionism are a bit different than the modern...
Well, of course, he is the father of what we call today the national liberal wing of Zionism, which on the one hand is very economically, say, pro free enterprise and less on the socialism that built up Israel at that time. On the other hand, very conservative in terms of relations with the Arabs, in terms of diplomacy and security issues. So there's a lot in here that is very relevant.
Wow. All right, so, what's one of your favorite passages? What's something that inspired you or, maybe surprised you during this latest round of research?
Well, what surprised me, I think, is the fact that despite the fact that he was engaged in major political battles at the time, again, we're talking about
with
26
Begin, with all sorts, yeah.
Well, all these issues are coming up. Menachem Begin a little bit later, shall we say?
Yeah.
However, he deals with literature. He deals with industry, and he goes into details, analyzing statistics about the various fairs, industrial fairs that we hear in North Tel Aviv at the time. And so you see a man who you thought, on the one hand, was a statesman, a politician, but he gets down into everything, and I think it's very relevant in terms of a human touch when you want to read about an historical figure and character.
Amazing. All right. Well, Israel, thank you so much for coming and sharing a bit about this book. Again, the new edition of Eretz Israel.
New edition, the Jabotinsky Institute, together with the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and soon will be on sale in bookstores and other places, including the Jabotinsky Institute.
Excellent. Israel Medad, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, the United States House of Representatives and Senate both passed with wide bipartisan support last Friday the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, which aims at identifying and addressing genocide and other crimes of the sort in a manner consistent with that of threats to national security. The bill was introduced in the summer of 2017, and President Trump is now expected to sign the bill into law in the coming days. Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, who sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and also co-sponsored the bill, said that, quote, America's strength around the world is rooted in our values. It's in our national interest to ensure that the United States utilizes the full arsenal of diplomatic, economic, and legal tools to take meaningful action before atrocities occur. Tragically, these atrocities are happening today, and we simply cannot wait to act." End quote. Now, in addition to changing the way the United States policy looks at genocide, American Foreign Service officials will also be given training in detecting genocide and crimes against humanity as early as possible. And further, a mass atrocities task force would also be assembled in order to, quote, "strengthen State Department efforts and assist other agency efforts at atrocity prevention and response, as well as to compile evidence to be presented to Congress annually as a part of the yearly crime report." Finally, in regards to the name, the bill is titled after Romanian-born Holocaust survivor and famous activist and author Elie Wiesel, who inspired millions against hatred through his books and through his memoir, Night. He also received the Nobel Prize in 1986. He died at 87 years old in 2016, but clearly his message lives on.
Archbishop Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, led the Christmas Eve midnight Mass on Monday in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, believed by Christians to be the birthplace of Jesus Christ.
And the Mass attracted hundreds of tourists from around the world and was also attended by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Palestinian Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah. In fact, this year Bethlehem is enjoying its busiest Christmas season on record and has fully recovered from a 10-year low in 2015 that followed the wave of knife stabbings and car ramming attacks. The Palestinian Ministry of Tourism said in early December that hotels were almost fully booked for the holiday season as well, due to the relatively calm security situation.
First of all, I want to greet you and all your delegation that you came. As according to tradition, you are part of the status quo now. You cannot avoid it. Tradition to celebrate with us this Christmas night. We are very happy to have you with us for what you represent.
Now, Christians comprise about 2% of Israel's population. According to a Central Bureau of Statistics report released ahead of Christmas, there are approximately 175,000 Christians living in Israel, more than 3/4 of whom are Arab Christians, and the localities with the largest Christian populations in Israel include Nazareth, Haifa, Jerusalem, and Shefaram. The report also revealed that the Christian population is growing. In 2017, the population grew by 2.2% compared to 1.4% the previous year, though this increase resulted mostly from the immigration of almost 600 Falashmura Christians from Ethiopia.
And now for our Hebrew word of the day. In light of the recently released polls ahead of the newly called elections, our word of the day is seker, or poll. You can conduct a seker, or a poll, on just about any opinion, from favorite foods to racial attitudes. And of course, you can also conduct many skarim, or polls, regarding political candidates. And to find out the results of the latest seker, or poll, just turn on the news. Just about every station will leseker, or cover the relevant content. Either way, we're all sure to see many more skarim over the next couple of months. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be clear to partly cloudy and cool with a low of 56 or 13 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow should be very similar with mostly sunny skies and a high of about 68 or 20 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.77 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Israel English News and on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.